Good morning, everyone. My name is Ayelet Hoffman Libson. I'm a professor of Talmud at Bar-Ilan University, and I am subbing for Michelle Farber this morning as she has lost her voice. We are learning Bava Kamma, Daf Kuf Tet Zayin, and we'll start right at the end of Daf Kuf Tet Vav. So yesterday we had a whole discussion about the difference between wine and oil. There was a braita on Kuf Tet Vav Amud Bet, which said that if you have 10 chaviyot, 10 barrels of tevel, and you see that one of them is broken, then you can immediately say, okay, this one is truma for the rest of them. But for oil, you shouldn't do that. And the Gemara discussed at length what is the difference between the wine and the oil. And it ended up by saying that we're concerned that with wine, you might have a takala. You might have, there might be a problem that will be created because if you leave the wine aside and it just sits there, then someone might end up using it for something which it's impermissible to use it for. So right at the end of the daf, the Gemara says, Takala atzma tanaihi. This debate that we just had about takala is not only an Amaraic debate, but it's actually a debate that already existed in the Tanaitic period. And it brings a braita, detanya, chavit shel yain shel truma shenitmet. Okay, so if we have a barrel of wine of truma, which became impure, Beit Shamai omrim tishafech hakol, uvet Hillel omrim te'aseh ziluf, right? That it can be used to pour it, to sprinkle it on the earth or on the entrance to the home to make it a better smell, and it can be used in that way. אמר רבי ישמעאל ברבי יוסי, אני אכריע, בבית תעשה זילוף, ובשדה תשפך הכל. Okay, so Rabbi Yishamel uses the language of אני אכריע, which sounds like he's about to say, I will bring some kind of proof, or I'll take one of the sides, Beit Shamai or Beit Hillel. And sometimes when that language is used, then what ends up happening is that the third opinion says, I take the side of the first position in one case, and I take the side of the second position in another case. But here, interestingly, Rabbi Yishmael says, Ani achriya, and he brings a different scenario that Beit Shamai and Beit Hillel don't seem to be talking about. Beit taseh ziluf. In the home, you can do a ziluf, you can do a sprinkling. V'basadeh tishafech hakol. But in the field, you have to throw it all out, basically. Ika de'amrei beyashan taseh ziluf, ubechadash tishafech hakol. Okay, and some say that what he said was the distinction that he made was not between the home and the field, but rather old wine or new wine. Amru lo, other sages said to him, En achra'a shlishit machra'at. Okay, and the commentators explain, what does this mean? That if there's a debate between Beit Shammai and Beit Hillel, then the third position is supposed to, in some way, if you want to create a hachra'a, it's supposed to in some way support one of the opinions. And instead, what Rabbi Yishmael is doing here is he's introducing new distinctions. And when you introduce new distinctions, then we're not going to accept these distinctions, and we're not going to give a psak according to these distinctions, but rather, basically, we're rejecting the third opinion, and we're limiting the machloket to be only a machloket of Beit Shammai and Beit Hillel. The Gemara now goes back to the Mishnah. So let's remember what the Mishnah on the previous page discussed. The Mishnah discussed two different cases. The first case was one person is holding a barrel of wine, and the other person has a barrel of honey. Honey is much more expensive than wine. And the person holding the barrel of wine sees that the barrel of honey is fractured and the honey is starting to ooze out. And so if he poured out the wine out of his barrel in order to collect the honey, שפך זה את יינו והציל את הדבש לתוכו, אין לו אלא שכרו. Okay, he only gets paid for his labor of what he did and the use of his barrel. But if he said explicitly, "Atzilet shelcha ve'ata noten li dmei sheli," okay, if he explicitly said, "I'm going to pour out my wine and you will then have to pay me such and such an amount in order to use my barrel for your honey," then the owner of the honey has to repay him what he asked for. That's case number one, which is actually two cases. And then we have the second case, which also has two subcases. And the second case is that there's two people are walking along with their donkeys. One donkey is worth 100 and the other donkey is worth 200. And it starts raining and there's a bit of a shitafon and the water is sweeping away the two donkeys. And then the owner of the donkey that's worth 100 says to the owner of the donkey that's worth 200, "I'm sorry." First of all, the case where he doesn't say anything, he just leaves his donkey. The owner of the cheaper donkey just leaves his donkey and rushes into the water to save the more expensive donkey. In this case, en lo ela scharo. He only gets the payment for the labor that he performed. But if he explicitly said to the owner of the more expensive donkey, "I'll save your donkey. I'm not going to invest now in saving my donkey, but rather I'll invest in saving your donkey, and you must pay me for that," in that case, the owner of the more expensive donkey has to pay him whatever he requested and the owner of the more expensive donkey agreed to. So now the Gemara asks why? Why is this so? Why does the owner of the more expensive donkey or the owner of the honey actually have to pay up? We know that in other cases, there can be circumstances of emergency circumstances where you agree upon something and then you don't ultimately have to end up paying what you promised. So the Gemara gives an example. Don't we have a braita that discusses a case like this? Someone's running away from prison. Let's assume it's a non-Jewish prison and he was put there unjustifiably, okay? And so he's running away from the prison. All of these scenarios are extremely dramatic. And he reaches a river and he can't cross the river, but there's a ferry there. And he says to the ferryman, "Here, tol dinar ve'avireni." Take a coin and a large amount of money and take me to the other side. En lo ela scharo. Ultimately, he doesn't have to pay him the whole dinar. He can just pay him whatever a regular ferryman would take for that trip. Alma amale mishatani becha. Right? He can say to him, "Oh, sorry, I was just fooling you because I had an emergency and I had to get to the other side." So here too, hachanami leimale mishatani becha. So the Gemara explains, no, it's not the same thing. Halo dami ela leseifa. Don't forget, there's also a seifa. There's an end to that braita about the man running away from prison. And what's the seifa? Im amar lo tol dinar ze bescharcha ve'avireni noten lo scharo mishalem. Okay? So at first blush, we might think that the difference between the reisha and the seifa is that in the reisha, he just says, "Take this money and take me to the other side." And in the seifa, he says, "Take this money bischarcha ve'avireni." Okay? But the Gemara doesn't explain it that way. The Gemara gives a different explanation and says, "Mishna reisha u mishna seifa." What's the difference between the beginning and the end? Amar Rami bar Chama, בצייד השולט דגים מן הים, ואמר לי, הפסדתני קברי בזוזה. So Rami bar Chama explains that there's actually a big difference between the beginning and the end. Because in the beginning, we're just talking about a person whose profession is to be a ferryman. So if the ferryman is going back and forth, and let's say he takes $5 each direction, and then I'm running away from prison and it's an emergency and I want him to already leave faster and not wait for extra passengers. So I say to him, okay, I'll pay you $1,000 to take me across. And then he takes me across. And then I could say to him, no, I won't pay you $5, but I'll pay you $10. Okay. Because that's the maximum that he would have gotten. Okay. But in the Seifa, the Seifa is talking about someone who's not even a ferryman at all. He's actually a fisherman. So when I rushed up to his boat and I said, take me to the other side, when I get to the other side, I can't just pay him $5 as I would pay a ferryman, because he's now lost all of the hundreds of dollars that he would have gotten for a very expensive tuna that he might have gotten just at that very moment. And therefore, I have to pay him for that, for what he's lost as well. So that's the difference between the Reisha and the Seifa. The Gemara now discusses the Seifa of our Mishnah, the case of the two donkeys. Shataf nehar chamoro v'chamor chavero, shelo yafeh maneh v'shel chavero yafeh matayim. And the Gemara says, wait a minute, isn't it the same principle in the beginning of the Mishnah and the end of the Mishnah? It seems like it's the same principle. If you didn't say explicitly that you have to pay me such and such amount, then you'll only get dmei scharo. But if you said explicitly, pay me such and such, then the owner of the honey or the owner of the more expensive donkey has to pay up. So why do we need both cases in that case? The Gemara says we do need both cases. Utzricha, de'ish me'inan kamaita. If we would have only had the case of the wine and the honey, hatamu dekiparesh yahiv le dmei kulei mishum de bayadayim kapasid. So if we would have only had the Reisha, then we would have thought that only in a case where a person is actively pouring out the wine and scooping out the honey with his hands, only in that case he'll really deserve to get the extra money. But here, in the case of the donkey, that anyway, the water is taking both donkeys away and he has to run after one donkey. So it doesn't really matter if he runs after one donkey or the other donkey. In that case, then we would think, no, he'll only get dmei scharo. He won't get the extra money that he agreed on with his friend. And therefore, the Mishnah has to tell us both cases to show us that also in the case of the donkeys, he will get the money that they both agreed on. Ve'yesh minan seifa, if the Mishnah would only have said the last case of the donkeys and not the first case of the honey and the wine, okay, so here in the case of the donkey, in the case where he didn't make an explicit agreement, then he'll only get the money for his labor, because anyway the donkeys are being swept away and he doesn't really have time to make too much of an agreement. Aval hatam, in the case of the honey and the wine, de bayadayim, ema afilu bestama yahiv le dmei kulei tzricha. Okay, we might have thought that in that case, because he's active, even though he didn't make an explicit agreement, nonetheless, the owner of the honey has to pay the owner of the wine whatever he wanted. And the Mishnah wants to teach us that no, only if they made an explicit agreement, then he'll have to pay him a larger amount. But if they didn't make an explicit agreement, then he only pays him dmei scharo. Ba'minei Rav Kahana merav. Rav Kahana asks a question of Rav. Let's say that yarad le'atzil ve'ala shelo me'elav ma'u. So we have two donkeys. One donkey costs 100 zuz, the other donkey costs or is worth 200 zuz. And the owner of the cheaper donkey decided to forego his own donkey in order to rescue the more expensive donkey. But while he was chasing after the more expensive donkey, his own donkey, which is worth 100 zuz, just managed to get away from the water and to come out of the water on his own. So what is the halacha in this case? Because we might think that in this case, if I put in the effort to chase after my friend's donkey, which is worth 200, but ultimately I didn't lose anything because my donkey, which is worth 100, was still saved. So maybe I shouldn't get any, my friend shouldn't have to pay me anything at all because I haven't lost anything. But the Gemara says, no, Mishmai Arachimu Alei. Okay, so from heaven, he had mercy from heaven, and the agreement between the two donkey owners still stands. And as an added benefit, I got my donkey back, so I got that benefit. And now the Gemara tells a story about Rav Safra, which demonstrates this principle. Ki had Rav Safra have a kazil b'she'arata. So Rav Safra was going along in a convoy, a group of people who were going from one place to another, and lavinu ahuari, they were accompanied by a lion. It's at first blush, it just sounds like there's a wild lion who's walking alongside them. And as we'll see in a moment, they have to keep feeding him animals every night in order to keep him satisfied. But Rashi and Tosfot both actually say that this was a tame lion, meaning it was trained to accompany the convoy in order to protect them from other wild animals. But they had to ensure that the lion was satisfied and wasn't hungry. And therefore, every night, one party of the convoy would give a donkey to the lion. So, so on the night that it was Rav Safra's turn to deliver a donkey to the lion, it happened to be the lion had already had enough donkeys that week, and he just didn't eat the donkey that Rav Safra had offered to him. And then Kadim Rav Safra v'zachay bei. So Rav Safra sees that the lion's not eating the donkey, so he jumps up and says, "Okay, I'm taking my donkey back. I'm making a kinyan to ensure that it's now my donkey again." Is that really necessary? Does he need to do that zchiyah, that action of making a kinyan, of demonstrating his ownership? It's clear to everyone that when he made a hefker, when he made the donkey hefker, it wasn't a general hefker. It was a hefker only for the purposes of the lion eating it. But nobody thought that if the lion doesn't eat it, then maybe someone else in the convoy can just adopt that donkey. So Ravina answers Rav Acha Midifti and says to him, "You're right, Rav Safra leravcha demilta u'de'avad. You're right, he really didn't have to do it, but he just did it so that nobody would say, that he grabbed something from Hefker that he wasn't supposed to, or maybe it should have belonged to someone else, and therefore he wanted to make that kinyan so that everybody would be clear that it's now his donkey again." Ba'minei Rav Mirabi. Another question that a student asks a master, in this case, Rabbi, the editor of the Mishna. Yarad la'atzil v'lo atzil. What happens if the owner of the cheaper donkey goes down to the river and tries to save the more expensive donkey, but he just doesn't manage to? He doesn't manage to. The donkey gets swept away. Amar lo v'zo she'ela. Rebbe answers Rav and says to him, "What's the question?" En lo ela scharo. In this case, he's for sure not going to get what the owner of the more expensive donkey agreed to pay him. No, he'll only be paid for his labor. But now the Gemara brings a kushia. Eitive, hasocher et hapoel le'avi kruv udur miskanin lechole. So someone hired a laborer to deliver cabbage and probably some kind of sour plums to a sick person. And this is supposed to heal the sick person. Okay. And then the laborer performs the journey and gets to the sick person's house. but halach u'mitzao shemet o she'evrei. He goes and he finds that the sick person is no longer sick. Either he's dead or he has already healed from his sickness. And yet, still, noten lo scharo mishalem. Okay, the laborer who took the cabbage and the plums will still get everything that was agreed upon. So this seems to be a stira to our case, where the two owners of the donkey made an agreement, and yet when the owner of the cheaper donkey tried to rescue the more expensive donkey but did not succeed, then Rebbe says that in this case, he only gets the sachar for his labor. He doesn't get what they agreed upon. So what's the difference between these cases, right? Rebbe answers Rav, who brought this kushia, and says, midame, are these similar? No. So in the case of the laborer who delivered the healing cabbage and plums, he performed his shlichut. He did what he was supposed to do. It's true, it didn't help, but it didn't help because the sick person was already healed or the sick person was already dead. That had nothing to do with him. That wasn't up to him. He did everything that he was supposed to do. In contrast, in the case of the donkey owner, then the agreement was that one person would manage to bring up a donkey, and he didn't manage to perform that shlichut, and therefore he doesn't get the payment that they agreed upon, but he only gets the more minimal payment of the time and energy that he wasted. Okay, now the Gemara is going to bring several braitaot which discuss different kinds of convoys. תנו רבנן, שיירה שהייתה מהלכת במדבר ועמד עליה גיס לטורפה. So there is a convoy of people who are walking together through the desert, and they're attacked by robbers. And the robbers are demanding of them, give us such and such an amount of money. And the robbers really don't care how the convoy divides it among themselves. But the braita does care. So the braita gives a principle and says, מחשבין לפי ממון ואין מחשבין לפי נפשות. So the way that you divide it up is not, as you might think, just by saying, okay, there's 30 people in this convoy, so each one pays a 30th of what the robbers are demanding, but rather you divide it according to the amount of money or the value of the schora, of the different things that people are carrying in the convoy. And if you think about it, that makes sense, because let's say that the robbers had to choose between two convoys that they wanted to attack, and they know that one convoy is a convoy of diamond merchants, and the other convoy is a convoy of, I don't know, Legos. So obviously they're going to prefer to attack the convoy of the diamonds. So the same thing is true also within one convoy. If we have some people who are Lego merchants and other people who are diamond merchants, then the people who are diamond merchants are going to have to pay a larger amount of what the robbers are requiring from the whole convoy. But if the convoy hired tayar, what's the word? Like some kind of leader, someone who will lead them through who will show them where to go, a guide, that's the word I'm looking for. So in that case, they do divide it according to the different people in the group and not according to the amount of money that each one of them is carrying with him. ולא ישנו ממנהג החמרים. And they shouldn't deviate from the custom of people who create convoys or who lead convoys. רשאים החמרים להתנות שכל מי שיאבד לו חמורו יעמיד לו חמור אחר. Okay, so what is חמרים? חמרים is actually from the word חמור, from the word donkey. So the braita is now telling us that donkey leaders can create a kind of an agreement, which is actually a form of insurance amongst themselves. They can decide that if there's, let's say, 30 people, 30 donkey leaders in one convoy, then they're going to agree that if one is attacked, let's say a lion attacks the donkey of one of the people in the group, then other people in the group will replace the donkey that was eaten. Okay, and so this agreement protects everybody because everybody knows that if they are damaged, then the other people in the convoy will help them. And this also motivates everybody to protect the convoy as a whole. But there's one caveat to that, which is that we want to ensure that people will really be careful with their donkeys, and therefore the Gemara says b'chusia en ma'amidin shelo b'chusia ma'amidim lo. So if he was negligent, Rashi says, then he won't have his donkey replaced, and if he wasn't negligent, then he will have his donkey replaced. Ve'im amar, what happens if, let's say, a lion attacked a certain donkey, and then the owner of the donkey says, you know what, we're so close to town already, I'd rather not have a donkey, I'd rather just have the value of that donkey, but I promise that I'll still continue to guard the convoy together with everybody else. Then the braita says, en shomim lo, they don't listen to him, and he can't take the value of the money. He has to take another donkey. So the Gemara says, pshita. Okay, that's obvious. Why is it so obvious? Probably because we want to ensure that he will really be committed to the convoy and committed to guarding just as he was before. So the Gemara says, Lo tzricha, we do need this case. Why? Because it might be that he didn't just have one donkey. Let's say he had two donkeys and one of them was stolen or was eaten. So you might think that if he has another donkey, then we can trust him to guard just like everybody else. And therefore, for the second donkey, he could just take the value, could just take the money rather than taking an actual donkey. The Gemara says the braita wants to teach us that it's not the same. Guarding one donkey is not the same as guarding two donkeys, and therefore we coerce him to take a second donkey rather than taking just the value of the donkey. Another braita, Tanu Rabbanan, and now we move from a convoy in the desert to a convoy upon water. ספינה שהייתה מהלכת בים, עמד עליה נחשול לטובעה. So there's a ship in the sea or in a river, and a wave is threatening to drown the boat, just like in the story of Yonah, and therefore the people on the boat now have to decide what they're throwing over the side. So how do they decide? מחשבים לפי מסוי ואין מחשבים לפי ממון. They don't do it by the value of the objects on the ship, but rather by the weight of the objects. Everybody has to throw off the same weight, even if the weight of gold is obviously going to be much more expensive than the weight of, I don't know, pillows that someone else might be taking across the seas. And here too, if there's a different custom, they go according to the custom of the seafarers. ורשאים הספנים להתנות שכל מי שעבדה לו ספינה יעמיד לו ספינה אחרת. So here we're talking about a slightly different scenario, that it's a group of boats that are together. So it's like a convoy of ships or of boats that are traveling together. And they made the same kind of insurance agreement that if one ship drowns, then the other people in the group will replace this ship for the person who lost it. But again, only if he was not negligent. So avdalo b'chusia en ma'amidim, shelo b'chusia ma'amidim lo. Ve'i peresh lemakom she'en asfinot holchin, en ma'amidim. If he drove his ship to a place where ships are not supposed to go, then also the other members of the convoy of the fleet are not going to replace his ship. So the Gemara says, Pshita, that seems obvious. It seems like the braita is just saying the same thing twice. If you're negligent, then you won't have your ship replaced. And if you take your ship to a place where ships aren't supposed to go, then you won't have your ship replaced. So what's the difference between those two cases? So the Gemara says, Tzricha, debenisan merachke chad ashla, ubetishrei merachke trei ashle. So in Nisan, where the water is very high at the end of the winter, then you can go only, let's say, one width away from the edge of from the beach or from the river bank. But in Tishrei, which is the end of the summer, then you go 2 widths away. Okay, so that the ship doesn't grind up on the rocks. And what happened here is Ka'azil beYomi Nisan lemakom Tishrei. Got a little bit mixed up, and in Nisan, in the winter, when the water was high, he went to where he would normally go in the summer. You might say, okay, this wasn't negligence. We understand why this happened to him, and therefore we will replace his ship. Therefore, Kamash Malan, therefore the Gemara teaches us that in this case too, his ship will not be replaced by the other people in the fleet. A third braita, Tanu Rabbanan, שיירה שהייתה מהלכת במדבר ועמד גיס וטרפה. So there's a convoy and they were attacked, and עמד אחד מהם והציל. One person managed to rescue part of the merchandise of the convoy. הציל האמצע. Okay, it's not just his. It's had to be divided between everybody else. ואם אמר אני אציל לעצמי, if he explicitly said what I'm risking my life now for in order to save this merchandise, it's only going to be for me, then הציל לעצמו. היכי דמי, what are we talking about here? אידה יכול להציל אפילו סיפה נמי לאמצע, ואידה לא יכול להציל אפילו רישה נמי לעצמו. If it's a case where it's not really possible to salvage anything, then even the seifa, even when he said it's going to be just for me, then that should be divided between everybody. And if it's not really something that you can salvage at all, then even the beginning where he didn't say it explicitly, it should still be something that he'll be able to benefit from himself. Amar Rami bar Chama, hacha b'shutafin askinan. We're talking about a case of partners, okay? So it's not just like him against a random group of people who are in the convoy, but him vis-a-vis his partners, his business partners. And this has to do with the question of kigon ze shutaf cholek shelo ledat chavero. Can one partner make a division or make an independent decision without consulting with the other partners? So, im amar palig velo amar lo palig. Okay, so if he explicitly said he's going to take something for himself, then he can divide away from the other partners. And if he didn't say, then he can't, and he has to give them their fair share of what he managed to rescue. Rava gives a different explanation. Hacha bepoalim askinan. This is similar to the case of a poel. Ukirav de'amar Rav, poel יכול לחזור בו אפילו בחצי היום. A poel can make, even if he agreed that he's going to work for the whole day, he can decide in the middle of the day that he's not going to work any longer. וכמה דלא הדר בי כברשותי דבעל הבית דמי. As long as he didn't announce that he's leaving, then he's considered as though he's working for the בעל הבית. וכי הדר בי תמה אחרינה הוא דכתיב כי לי בני ישראל עבדים ולא עבדים לעבדים. Okay, and when he says, no, sorry, I'm going to take what's good for me, then that's similar to the poel who also says, I'm not your slave. I'm working for you, but you're not my owner. I'm an eved Hashem. I'm not an eved of yours. and therefore he can break the contract in the middle of the day. Rav Ashi gives a third explanation, כשיכול להציל על ידי הדחק. גלי דעתי לעצמו, לה גלי דעתי לאמצע. Okay, so if these are extreme circumstances, then it just depends if he announces it. Okay, if he says explicitly, I want to take this for myself, then he can. And if he didn't, then he's going to have to divide the property that he managed to rescue with other people. So this is the end of the discussion of the Mishnah regarding the honey, the wine, and the two donkeys. And the main principle that we saw there is that it's very significant if a person announced that he's going to do something for the other party, or if he just did it without making that announcement. The next Mishnah discusses a case of a gazlan, of a thief, but the thief was also stolen from. Okay, so הגוזל שדה מחברו ונטלוה מסיקים. So someone stole a field from another person. And we're going to see that there'll be a discussion in the Gemara about, is it possible to actually steal a field? And how is this different from stealing movable property? But we'll leave that for tomorrow. So what happened? He stole a field from his friend, and then other people, masikin, who are some kind of institutionalized thieves, came and stole the field back from him. If this is just something that is happening all over the place, that they're, like the Romans are walking around and telling the Jews, sorry, we're taking this field, we're doing a hafka'ah, sorry, this is no longer your field. So in that case, then the thief doesn't have to return a different field to the person that he stole the field from, because it could have equally happened to the owner of the field. So the thief doesn't owe anything specific to the owner of the field. Aval if those masikin stole the field dafka because of the gazlan, then he is obligated towards the owner and he will have to return a different field. So the Gemara first discusses the term masikin, and it says you could read this as masikin or you could read it as matzikin, and either way you read it, you'll have support. אמר רב נחמן בר יצחק, מן דתני מסיקין לא משתבש ומן דתני מציקין לא משתבש. מן דתני מציקין לא משתבש, דכתיב במצור ובמצוק אשר יציק לך אויביך. Okay, so we can see that this is, someone, the enemy is taking, is harming you, so it can be the language of matzik. ומן דתני מסיקין לא משתבש, דכתיב Yaresh hatzlatzal. Okay, the tzlatzal is the most commentators explain that it's the arbe, or it's some kind of grasshopper that's raiding the field. And the targum for that term is yachsenine saka'a. So saka'a sounds like masikin, and therefore someone who is destroying the field can also be called a masik, or also a matzik. So now the Gemara says, okay, we saw in the Mishnah this term, im mechamat hagazlan chayav. Hey chidami, what are we talking about? How could it be that they're stealing the field dafka because of the gazlan? And the Gemara explains, ilema de ansua le'ar adidei velo ansua kulei arata, hamereisha shmat mina, imakat medinai v'chulei ve'ilo, right? So if you're trying to make a distinction between something that is happening to everyone versus something that is happening specifically to this person, we could have heard that from the Reisha, because the Reisha says, im kat medinahi, right? If this is something that's happening to everyone, then the din is X, and if not, then the din is Y. So what is the term im chazmat gazlan? What chidush is there in that? So the Gemara says, Lo tzricha de'ach ve'echvuye. We're talking about a case where the gazlan actually pointed towards a specific field and told these masikin, here, take this field. okay? And therefore it's something very active that he did. Lishna acharina, a different way that the sugya was brought down. Hacha b'mayaskinan kigon de'ansu agoyim ve'amrei lei achvui arate ve'achvehu be'adayu. Okay, so the masikin said to this gazlan, show us your fields. We're going to take all of your fields. And he pointed out not only his fields, but also the field of someone else, which he had stolen. And that's why they took that field. So someone pointed out the, not exactly the field, but the piles of wheat that had already been collected in the fields of the Reish Galuta, of the XLR. And that person, the thief, came before Rav Nachman, and Rav Nachman coerced him to repay what he had pointed out and had been taken by the Masikim. And now we have a window into the Bet Midrash, and we hear that Yativ Rav Yosef achorei de Rav Huna bar Chia, ve'yativ bar Huna bar Chia kamei de Rav Nachman. So Rav Yosef was sitting behind Rav Huna bar Chia, and Rav Huna bar Chia was sitting before Rav Nachman while Rav Nachman gave this psak. And Amali Rav Huna bar Chia le Rav Nachman, dina o knasa. What you determined that this man has to repay the piles of wheat. Was this actually the din? Is this mi'ikar din? Or is this a knas? Is this a kind of extra punishment that you're giving him in order to teach him a lesson? Amale matnitin hi, right? We can derive it from our Mishna. Ditnan, im chamat gazlan chayav le'amid lo sadeh, ve'okimna de'acha ve'yachvuye. Okay, so we determined from the Mishnah that in a case where a person specifically pointed out, then he's going to have to repay. Batal de nafak, after Rav Nachman went out, Amar Rav Yosef le Rav Huna bar Chia, mai nafkalach mine iknasa idina iknasa, right? Why did you ask that question? What difference does it make why he gave his psak, if it's the din or if it's the knas? Amale idina gamrinan mine, iknasa lo gamrinan mine. Okay, so if it is the black letter of the law, if it is mi shurat hadin, then we can expand that ruling to other cases. But if it's a knas that he gave this punishment to this person, but it's not mi'ikar hadin, then we won't be able to expand it to other cases, and maybe we won't even be able to expand it to other people, to other scenarios. And now we'll have a short discussion about, do we actually learn from cases that are knas or not? Umina temra de miknasa lo gamrinan. Where do you derive that this principle that we don't learn from a knas? Detanya, barishona hayu omrim hametameh ve'amenasech, chazru lomar af hamedameh. So what are we talking about here? We're talking about cases that appear in several places in the Talmud together. They usually come together. Hametameh ve'amenasech ve'amedameh. These are all cases in which you're actually causing some kind of damage to another person, but the way that you're causing the damage is halachic damage. Okay, so it's not something that you can see the difference in the object or in the produce, but it's a halachic kind of damage. So let me explain. What is hametameh? Hametameh is when you take taharot, you take something that is pure and you make it impure. So now it's lost basically all its value. And menasech is when you take something, you take wine and you make it into yain nesech. You turn it into wine that is sacrificed to avodah zarah. So again, it can no longer be used by a Jew, basically. And what is medameh? Medameh is when you mix truma with chulin. And now there's a mixture, there's a ta'arovet, and you can't sell this mixture anymore to anyone but a kohen. And because you can only sell it to the kohen, then that means that there's much less demand for this mixture now, and therefore the price will plummet. It's still worth something, but it's worth much less than it was worth before. Okay, so in all of these cases, the Mishna and the Tosefta in various places say that it's still considered damage, and you have to pay for that damage. But what's interesting in this braita specifically is that the braita is saying that at first, in the first stage, you only had to pay for the damages of the mitameh and the menasech, and only at a later stage you also had to pay for the medameh. So the Gemara says, "Chazru in, lo chazru lo." My tama, right? If they wouldn't have instituted an edict specifically regarding the medameh, then we wouldn't have been able to derive the case of the medameh from the case of the mitameh ve'amenasech. So from here we can learn lav mishum de knaso v'knasa lo gamrinan minei. Okay, because if we could derive something from a knas, then we could have just derived the medameh from the case of the menasech and the mitameh. If we can't make that derivation, then we learn from that you can't expand a knas to other cases. So the Gemara says, no. There was a different reason that they had to do this in two stages. לא, מעיקר הסברי להפסד מרובה חששו, להפסד מועט לא חששו, ולבסוף סברי להפסד מועט נמי חששו. So we said that in the case of the mitameh and the menasech, it's a huge loss, because basically nobody can use this produce anymore. By contrast, the case of the midameh, the Kohanim can still use it, so the worth of the produce has plummeted, but it is still worth something. So in the first stage, they said, we're only going to make a person pay damages in the case of ifsed merubeh, in the case of mitameh and menasech. But in the case of medameh, we won't make them pay. And in the second stage, they said, no, lefsed mu'at nami chashishu. You have to pay also for the medameh. So it doesn't have to do with the knas. Ini, is this true? V'hatane avua de Rabbi Avin. Barishona היו אומרים, a different version of this braita, barishona היו אומרים המטמא והמדמע. Not the מטמא והמנסך, אלא המטמא והמדמע. חזרו לומר, אף המנסך. חזרו in, לא חזרו לא. So it sounds like if they wouldn't have created a second stage of the decree, then you wouldn't have been able to derive the case of the menasech from the earlier cases of the mitameh ve'amedameh. And isn't this because you can't expand a knas? Mai tama lav mishum de lo gamrinan miknasa? No, that also can't teach us that principle that you can't expand a knas, because there mikar savri k'Rabbi Avin ulevasof savri k'Rabbi Yirmiyah. What are the cases that they're talking about? Mikar savri k'Rabbi Avin da'amar Rabbi Avin. Rabbi Avin is talking about a case of damages that occurred on Shabbat. זרק חץ מתחילת 4 ולבסוף 4 וקרא שיראים בהליכתו, פטור. שהרי עקירת צורך הנחה היא ומתחייב בנפשו. So this is a case that's talking about someone who shot an arrow from one place to another, and it passed through arba amot on Shabbat, and therefore he's mitchayev benafsho. Therefore he deserves the death penalty because of the avera of Shabbat, and therefore he's patur of the damages that he did, because he can't also get the death penalty and also be chayav for the damages. Okay. But levasof savre k'Rabbi Yirmiyah, de'amar Rabbi Yirmiyah, mishat hagbaha kanye, ichayev lemamon, mitchayev benafsho lo have ad shat nisuch. So Rabbi Yirmiyah is talking about the case of yein nesech, and he says you, as soon as you lift it up, you're becoming obligated because you're taking something that doesn't belong to you. Okay. But you only become mitchayev benafsho, you only become liable for the death penalty when you actually do the nisuch, when you actually do the avodah zarah, and therefore the two stages are separate. in contrast to the case of the arrow, where with the very same action you create the damages, and you're also mitchayev benafshecha, you're also liable for the death penalty. Okay, so this goes back to the braita that we saw about the menasech, that at first they thought that only in a case where with one action you're becoming liable for two averot, only in a case like that there's the gzera. And in the second stage, they said no, even in a case where you become liable in two separate steps, then you are liable, and that's why they needed these two different stages that we saw in the braita. Thank you. Have a wonderful day, and good luck to everyone.